The support, you said before that you went to the minister, convinced the minister that a lower tax rate was better, and it sounds like then the minister was very easy to go and convince Congress.
We were fortunate enough that we had one big decision, and it's one that I didn't mention there. It was probably a very important one. The leader of the opposition in Parliament said to the government, if you do the right thing, even though it is not popular, we will support you. That was very important. His name was Alan Dukes, and he said, I'm the leader of the opposition, but we will, of the major party in the opposition, we will support you when you make these tough decisions. Before that, every time the leader of the opposition, when the government made a non-popular decision, such as, let's say, cutting back on the cost of healthcare, the opposition voted against them, and therefore the government couldn't do it. On this occasion, the opposition supported them almost every time. That was a dramatic change.
So the opposition was educated enough to understand that these changes would help?
I think they were educated enough, but even more so, they were scared as well. And they recognized that the population, this was not popular, because their members of the party said, why don't you have a go at the government? Why don't you bring the government down? But this leader said, no, we will support the government if it's the correct thing for the economy. And of course, after 3 years, it was the correct thing. And then there was another 3 years as well.
Was that party ever go to become government?
Yes, it did, for a period of 2.5 years in the 90s. And by that time, they had become convinced. That
so they just... you say consistency is probably one of the most important things you can do with it.
Yes, I think one of the... Let me just take tax as an example. When the government said, we are going to bring down the company tax, corporation tax, from 30% to 12.5%, we're going to do it over 5 years. And they continued to do it even when they went out of office and the new government, the opposition, came in. They said to everybody, you can rely on us. We will keep our promises. So consistency that you use is a very good word. It continued to... And each time they reduced the tax, more business came in. There's a lovely story about the Minister for Finance in the 1990s who lived in County Kildare, and he's now a minister in Europe, very important position. And County Kildare is big into horse racing and big into horses. And so he's very interested. He never misses a horse race meeting. When he reduced the betting tax from 20% to 10%, the trade unions, the socialists, all the opposition said, oh, that's disgrace, you are looking after your friends. But the following year he said, look, I took in more money at 10% than I did at 20%, so I'm going to reduce it to 5%. And when he did that, he took more money in again. Now, you can only go so far. But it was a real example of him proving, I'm going to reduce the tax and bring in more money. And it's more important to count money than it is percentage.
And a lot has been said about education. They say you did improvements in education, you invest more money in education. But what do you think the specific things you did that were so important? Because these countries in Latin America, for example, we spend money in education, but we don't spend it well. You look into how much of the GDP we spend in education is probably a good number, but then we get no results. So maybe you can tell us a little bit of what exactly did you do with this?
Oh, well, I'd love to tell you that everything succeeded, but that would not be correct. But we did enough to make it succeed. We changed, when I was growing up, when I was at university, most of the education was geared towards the arts and law and the professions. What we managed to do is to concentrate on science, technology, particularly in regard to innovation, but also business as well. And once we began to concentrate on that, and particularly on science, technology, and innovation, those areas, and business, those areas began to be regarded as more important than the arts. Now, the arts are still very important, and I wouldn't reduce that importance. But that meant we became innovative. And some of those innovations just, where Ireland had been regarded as a backward country, suddenly young, bright people who had been regarded as failures because, they were they were not leading the charge, suddenly began to have confidence. And when they had confidence, it was amazing the things that were achieved. For instance, the biggest customer that Boeing airplanes has was a small Irish airline that started in Ireland with Irish money and Irish entrepreneurs. And they are now the biggest customer last year that Boeing had. Now, that's a company called Ryanair. They were just an example. It's still an Irish company. There may be foreign investors now, but it's still basically an Irish company. Another company, just to give one example, it's called Identigen. It's an investment in DNA technology that identifies the traceability of meat products. And when meat safety became important, that sort of product and that sort of technology. Now they are technology that were developed in universities or schools of technology in Ireland. And that gave confidence to people. And that's a part of what we had to achieve was confidence.
But also, didn't you work out like doing tests for the living certificate? Could you explain a little bit more about gearing and orienting people towards more of the skills they would have and try to boost the skills of people as well?
What happened in the past was that there were always, and still are, people left behind by the education system. And they're left behind at a very early age because their talents, their intelligences that they had were not being measured by the system. And you know, when you're 5 years old or 6 years old or 10 or 12 or 14, if you're at the back of the class, the teacher concentrates on the bright, attractive people in the front. And this 20% or maybe even more been left behind. The Leaving Cert applied said we are going to measure other intelligences rather than just the intelligence of writing a good article. Let me take the example, because I was in charge of that particular scheme for 5 years. The example of communication. Now, the vast majority of communication, just like today, is spoken. It's very important to be able to communicate in written form. But those 20% who are being left behind very often were not regarded as successful because they were not good at writing essays. And certainly not good at writing an essay in an examination that took 3 hours after 2 years of study. But when they were given the chance of being examined in their ability to communicate in written form, such as debate and talking, suddenly they blossomed, they grew, and they gained in confidence. And the objective of that was to identify the intelligences. And I use the word intelligence purposely because we used to use the word talent and skill, but it's actually a form of intelligence that had not been identified beforehand. And the aim of that, and we have been only partially successful, was to bring those young people forward. Let me take two names that you may know of. In England, Richard Branson was a failure at school. In Ireland, a man called Bob Geldof was a failure at school. Both of them have been hugely successful in other enterprises, but they were regarded as failures. Now, that's the sort of thing that we said, let's identify those who are being left at the back of the class and give them the opportunity to come forward. And that has been a success, only partially successful, but it's on its road and it's on its way, and I believe it's a very important element.